Welcome to Humanism Now, a podcast about secular ethics, curiosity, and compassionate change. I'm your host, James Hodgson. In April 2025, the Bible Society published a report called The Quiet Revival, which made headlines with the claim that there was a rapid surge in UK church attendance in the UK, particularly among young men and adults aged 18 to 24. That report was subsequently withdrawn and the claims retracted by both YouGov and the Bible Society. However, that report marks the latest in a long line of studies asserting a religious revival in the UK, and yet the data continues to tell a different story. Our guest today is Dr. David Voas, Emeritus Professor of Social Science at the University College London, where he led the Social Research Institute from 2016 to 2020. A quantitative social scientist whose career has focused on religious change in modern societies, Dr. Voas was a leading commentator on this study and on the broader trajectory of religion in the UK. His TEDx talk, Why There Is No Way Back for Religion in the West, has been viewed nearly 2 million times. And today we'll be discussing what happened with that report, what the data actually shows, and what it tells us about the state of religion and irreligion in Britain today. Dr. David Voas, welcome to Humanism Now.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Perhaps we could start by setting the scene. What was the Quiet Revival report and what were its main claims?
The main claims of the report were that total church-going had gone up by more than half between 2018 and 2024. So basically from just before the pandemic to just after the COVID pandemic. Within that, Anglican attendance had increased by about 30%, Catholic attendance had more than doubled, and as you mentioned, young men's attendance had increased fivefold since 2018. So an astonishing rise in the church-going of young men, such that, in fact, across the whole age range, men were now more likely to be churchgoers than women, except I think in the very oldest age groups. In the 18 to 34 age group, men were supposedly nearly twice as likely as women to be churchgoers. More than 1 in 5 young men were going to church. And close to half of young black people aged 18 to 34 were attending at least monthly. So a whole set of really astonishing findings from YouGov surveys that had been conducted in 2018 and 2024. One of the key features of the Quiet Revival report was that it was based entirely on a comparison between these two surveys. They referred to no other evidence at all. And of course, we have a great deal of evidence on church-going. We have the churches themselves that do attendance counts, and we have various social surveys. So it was hard not to be skeptical of those findings that contradicted everything that we thought we knew, and indeed, I suspect everything that ordinary churchgoers knew just from going along on a Sunday.
Where did the methodology break down? Was this an issue in the data or the methodology applied to the data?
It's basically a data problem, and here I'm afraid you get into the details of sampling that may not be of huge general interest. But in the old days, if you wanted to do a social survey, you, as the data collector, went and approached people. So you were the one who brought people into your sample. Ideally, you sampled addresses or individuals randomly, so you ended up with a good cross-section that you could then use the laws of probability to work out margins of error and so on. That's still in use by gold standard social surveys, but it's a very expensive and time-consuming method of going about things. So increasingly, people are building online panels where individuals claim to be of a certain set of characteristics, and they opt into these panels. And then companies like YouGov will send out a survey to all of these people who have volunteered or opted into the panel. I mean, typically they have a panel of many hundreds of thousands of individuals, and for any given survey, they'll select a few thousands of those to answer the questions. That is difficult for a number of reasons. And the most relevant one here is that we don't actually know that these people are who they say they are, or even that they're real people. The rise of AI chatbots, particularly since 2022, has meant that it's now possible for artificial intelligence to simulate the behavior of human beings in a way that is virtually undetectable. So it's quite possible to have large-scale survey farming, to use the term, going on, where people are either genuine people, just not who they say they are, or potentially real people who are just answering rapidly with no particular concern for the questions and the subject matter, or finally AI chatbots that are trained to simulate human behavior in taking these questionnaires.
If I understand correctly, this is a problem at the source of the data which they were gathering, that there's a lack of reliability, that the inputs that have been given are actually true or even real people.
Yes, I should say that we're speculating a bit, and YouGov has admitted that it has a problem with bogus respondents, and in this particular study, it did not successfully filter out bogus respondents. But they have not gone into detail about the nature of those bogus responses, and we don't know a lot more. I know one of the huge problems now that goes beyond the Bible Society report for the whole survey industry is that the business model of these companies doing polls based on an opt-in online sample, that business model is under threat. And it's clearly commercially sensitive. The companies are reluctant for clients and the general public to lose confidence in the findings of the studies. So it's then very hard to collaborate with them to investigate the sources of these problems, because it's not something that they particularly want to publicize.
Is this a broader problem that we're seeing in a lot of these large population statistics and population polling that's taking place?
I think it is a broader problem. It's one that almost certainly affects not just this study, but others as well. The Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. has pointed to a number of very interesting examples of cases where these opt-in survey findings are clearly implausible, in some case quite humorously. I don't want to get into a big argument with YouGov or any of its competitors, but I think they recognize behind the scenes that they have a serious problem on their hands and are in a sort of arms race with the bad actors to try to maintain the credibility of their findings. So on the one hand, you have increasingly sophisticated exploitation and infiltration of the survey panels, and on the other, you have the companies themselves who are trying desperately to filter out fraudulent or bogus respondents. And I think there must be serious questions about how successfully they've managed to do that.
So were there any reliable conclusions that could have been drawn from the study?
I don't think so. The problem is that once you recognize that the set of respondents includes a lot of nonsense, then unless you can identify which cases are good and which cases are bad, and YouGov has said they just can't do that, then you don't really have any confidence in any of the findings. The Bible Society has continued to claim that there is a revival going on, that it's just that we can't use this particular study as evidence for it. I think that's like claiming that you're a little bit pregnant. I mean, either something is really happening or there's no reason to believe that it is. And at the moment, I don't think that we have any solid evidence of a religious revival underway in England, or for that matter, anywhere else.
Yes, and I do want to dive into what the data is currently showing. But I think before we do it, I'd be interested to know, how common is it for a study of this size to be retracted?
It's very uncommon. We're seeing a problem in science generally of occasionally, well, either outright fraud or simply bad mistakes being made and then articles retracted. But it's uncommon for articles in scientific journals to be retracted, and it's perhaps even more uncommon for papers published by advocacy groups to be retracted. So it was a considerable surprise when that was done earlier this year, and nearly a year after the report was published. I think that YouGov recognized that it needed to do something, that the findings were simply not credible. They even contradicted other findings from polls that YouGov had conducted themselves for other clients. And I suspect that YouGov realized that they were actually losing more credibility by maintaining the fiction that everything was fine than by putting their hands up and saying, we got this one wrong. I think somewhat conveniently, they're now implying that it was just an issue with that particular survey, that in effect, some junior employee hadn't switched on the magic fraud detection device. I don't think there is any such magic fraud detection device. I think there's an enormous problem in trying to filter out bogus respondents, and actually it's almost impossible to do that with complete success. So I'm not saying they're telling porkies. I believe that they're sincere in saying that more could have been done, more should have been done at the time to filter out fraudulent responses. But I think that this is a deep-seated systemic problem, not just something that went on with this particular survey.
Yes, and I think that's been clear in a lot of the criticisms of the survey that have come out afterwards, is that it's not implying any intention on YouGov or the Bible study to mislead, but that this is a challenge, and by the sounds of it, one that's going to become much more prevalent and more difficult to deal with, particularly with the rise of AI and the anonymity of the internet.
Yes, it is a fascinating issue. You know, there are things that the survey companies could, in principle, do, demanding ID, for example, from people joining their panels. Even that perhaps is not foolproof because you can fake ID. But their concern is that by making it more difficult to join a panel, they will end up having a bad effect on the composition, and the people who join the panels will then be atypical because they will be especially trusting and willing to provide ID, for example. And that's a legitimate concern. But I think one way or another, they're probably going to have to come up with methods of somehow more rigorously confirming that the individuals on the panels are who they say they are.
So let's get into the details of how we can test and measure religiosity in a society. Belief and belonging mean very different things to different people. So how do you quantify something as intangible as religious belief?
There are three key ways that we try to get at religious involvement. The simplest and most often used is simply self-identification as religious or belonging to a specific group. So the census, for example, in England and Wales asks a very simple question: what is your religion? And then the responses are no religion, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jewish, so on. And you tick a box or you write in a response. I should say that humanists are not particularly happy with that question because the question, what is your religion, implies that you have one, even though the first response on the list is no religion. Anyway, that's one method of getting at some kind of religious connection or involvement, is saying, do you have a religion? And you could get at that via other ways of measuring affiliation. Have you been baptized, or what's your religious heritage, or whatever? But anyway, identity is one key method. Practice is maybe the second most commonly measured indicator. And practice is very often, at least in the West, measured by whether people go to a worship service, be it church, synagogue, mosque, whatever. So you can ask people in the last week or month, have you been to a service at one of these places? And then they will say yes or no, or you can ask them how often they go, and the answers might range from never to more than weekly. And you can ask about things other than attendance. You can ask about frequency of prayer, for example. So religious practice, anyway, is the second big domain. And then finally, there's belief. So here we would measure that, again, in the West, typically by asking if people believe in God, or if they believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or some other doctrinal points. Do you believe in life after death, heaven, hell, and so on? So there are lots of different beliefs that could be measured, belief in God being the most common one. And even that is very complex because God doesn't have a single meaning. People can believe in different kinds of gods, either with no doubts or some doubts or not sure. And you might find belief waxing and waning over the course of a month or a year or a lifetime. There's a lot of nuance here that can be difficult to capture, but those are three key indicators that we might look at. And then there are other kinds of things that you could ask about on surveys, about how important religion is, for example, or how important you might find God in your life. You could ask about values or the source of values. So often on social surveys that are really focused on religion, there'll be a whole battery of items. And it isn't just a simple matter of, are you religious? Yes, no.
And you've been studying this for many years?
Too long, yes.
What does the data show, and has that trend been consistent?
The data show that across the Western world and increasingly across the globe, religion measured in all of those ways is on the decline in most places. I'll get into more details later, but the big story is one of secularization, of people increasingly not saying they have a religion, not doing religious things, and not believing religious things. Now, that change is largely generational. So it's not a matter of people in adult life saying, you know what, I'm done with religion. I've been going to church up until this point. I've now turned 40 or 50, and I'm just not interested anymore. I mean, that does happen, but more often what happens is that young emerging adults who perhaps were raised in families that were religious simply aren't especially interested in continuing to go to church or to call themselves Catholic or Anglican or whatever. And so the change is basically generational. Once you get to your mid-20s, it's actually not very common for people then to change their habits and identities. Not that that doesn't happen. There are many people who in adult life either find faith or lose faith. I'm not saying that that is impossible, but within any given generation, the gains and losses tend to balance out. And the real change is occurring at the point at which people are coming into adulthood, perhaps setting up home on their own, and then establishing, if you like, their own identities and practices and beliefs independently of their families of origin.
What evidence do we have on the influences for this trend towards secularization?
We have an awful lot of evidence and theories, but it still remains very controversial. We don't have a really good explanation of precisely what it is that pushes people towards secularity. I think one nice way of framing the matter was suggested by another academic from Switzerland, actually, Jörg Stolz, who refers to secular competition with religion and is just pointing to the idea that actually has been discussed for a while, that secularity offers many alternatives to religious services and beliefs. So if you want counseling, for example, instead of going along to your pastor or priest and asking for guidance, you might go to a therapist or some other source of secular guidance. And the same is true across a whole realm of activities. I mean, if you want entertainment on a Sunday, there are many things that you can do other than go to church. And it might seem surprising to us now, but 100 years ago, going to church on a Sunday was actually a form of entertainment. There wasn't a lot else available. It was something that was potentially interesting. It allowed you to meet friends, perhaps find marriage partners, perhaps even potential business partners. Who knows? Nowadays, not only are sports teams playing, but shops are open, the televisions are on, there are lots and lots of things competing with churches for our time and attention. So we find that kind of secular competition across the board, really. And I think it's also true that the rise of technology, perhaps even more than science itself, has given people changed understanding of how the world works, and we're now less likely to have a supernaturalist worldview of mysterious interventions in reality. We take much more pragmatic, technocratic view of how the world works. Even the Pope, I think, is in some ways living in a less supernaturalistic world than somebody in a traditional society now, or certainly a couple of 100 years ago, when almost literally the trees would be inhabited by spirits.
The three areas that you mentioned in terms of how we would define religiosity, in terms of self-identification, attendance, or practice, and then really drilling into what people believe. Is the change and the decrease kind of linear and related across those? Or are we seeing actually, whilst people may still associate with a religion or a faith, the beliefs are, the specifics of the belief are changing faster?
It's an interesting issue, the ordering of change. And I think it hasn't been particularly clear how the process works. There was a very important paper, again with first author Jörg Stolz, published just last year, suggesting that what first tended to decline is practice, because that actually takes time and effort. So it's sort of natural that if you start to feel yourself not as religious as you used to be, you'll be less committed to attending every week, for example. And then religion will start to seem less important than it did before. And then finally, as a last stage, you will stop identifying with a particular religion or denomination. They didn't, the authors of this paper, go into belief because we don't actually have good data on belief from around the world in all the countries that they considered. So it's a little bit difficult to say how that works. My own view on belief is that it spans the whole process. So I think that at the beginning, people live in a very God-centered world. That is, they see the supernatural everywhere around them. This was sort of characteristic, again, of traditional societies, but probably medieval Europe as well. Even if you weren't actively religious, you still thought that God was at work in the world, and probably not just God, but demons and angels and other things. And in any case, it was a world that was supernatural as well as natural. And slowly, that sort of supernaturalism declined. That's not to say that even in the final stages of secularization, you don't have some residual belief in something out there. So that's why I say it's not binary. First we believed and then we didn't believe. I think that the substance and strength and salience or importance of belief gradually erodes over many generations.
And it's interesting that you say that the trend is generational. It's not as people age. It is with each new generation, which really does show why there was so much disbelief, or that this report was so shocking, that it was young people that were bucking the trend.
Exactly. It seemed to suggest that everything we thought we knew was being overturned. And that would have been very exciting. They tended, that is, the Bible Society, to engage in somewhat ad hominem attacks on people like me, suggesting that we were just secularists who had an agenda. Actually, my more important identity is as a social scientist. And as a social scientist, this would have been fascinating if it had been true, because it would have been like discovering a new planet. It would have overturned our understanding. The late scientist Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's something that is important to bear in mind when dealing with this sort of assertion. And we just didn't have evidence that would overthrow decades and decades worth of both fact and theory.
And you made what some might see as an extraordinary claim in the title of your TEDx talk, which I mentioned in the intro, and I do recommend listeners check out. We'll include a link in the show notes. It's been a decade or more now, I think, since that talk. You also gave a talk at the Humanist UK convention, which was that humanism is the future. Do you still see that there's no way back for religion in the West, and possibly that humanism is the future?
I would maintain that. It's not just me. Interestingly, to again refer to work done by other people, there's a very well-known sociologist of religion named Christian Smith, one of the best-known scholars in the field working today. And he is not a secularist. He's a churchgoer. He has been a long-time critic of the secularization thesis. But last year, he published a book called Why Religion Went Obsolete. And he makes a claim that is at least as strong as any claim that I've made, which is not merely that Christianity today is going through a bad patch in America, and it's, if you like, in the trough of a cyclical movement with ups and downs, and we just happen to be in one of the down periods. He's actually saying, no, it's going obsolete and it's not going to come back. It's just simply incompatible now with the way people think and the way the world works. Now, he's still maintaining that, in fact, people might be spiritual in other ways. I wouldn't necessarily agree with his perspective in general or his explanation for what's happened. I'm just making the point that the sort of assertion that I have made is no longer regarded as being outrageous, that even very mainstream social scientists of opposing quasi-religious perspectives, if you like, are saying something similar. So because the change is generational, it is also very gradual. This is not something that we're going to see being very different in 10 or 20 years' time, or even necessarily in our lifetimes, because it will be a matter of our generation being replaced by a somewhat less religious one in the population, and that generation in turn being replaced by a slightly less religious generation. And so the whole process goes on for well over 200 years. And we're well into it, but there's quite a ways still to go. It does seem to me, though, that this is a transition, what I've called a secular transition by analogy with the demographic transition. And it is very difficult to reverse.
And is there a direct correlation with association with secular humanism related to the decline in association with religion?
I think religion has performed certain functions, and those functions need to be replaced. Now, they are replaced by all kinds of different things, from science to football. So it's not that humanism is going to come along and provide the kind of comprehensive, totalizing life solution or authoritarian control over life that maybe religion might have had or aspired to have at some point in the past. But I think in terms of underlying morality and worldview, we are becoming essentially humanists, whether we call ourselves that or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, my concern is always with the decline of religiosity, or certainly belonging, that there are other forms of group identities that become more important than that. But humanism, I think, can offer a positive association and identity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's what people will gravitate towards just because they don't have faith or religion in their lives.
I think that's a fair point. We could become nationalistic, chauvinistic in different ways. Racist or completely egotistical. I mean, there are any number of potential ideologies or personality types that might come to the fore, and maybe we shouldn't be mindlessly optimistic and thinking that it's bound to be humanism that replaces the old religious order. I think the signs are generally positive from countries that are maybe a little bit further along in the secular transition than we are. I mean, Scandinavia, for example, is often held up as being kind of social model in terms of its general embrace of tolerance and welfare and so on. And those societies, I think, are more humanistic and basically less religious, even though often many Scandinavians continue to have a religious identity because religion and nationality are sort of bound up together, but they're typically less believing and less practicing than we are in Britain. In any case, I'm trying to offer some grounds for the optimistic position.
Well, thank you very much for explaining everything there. It's really been a fascinating case and a fascinating discussion. Before we go, I'm curious, in your career as a social scientist, what principle of social science, or particularly population statistics, do you wish was better understood in society? Because obviously we see headlines, we get told about reports all of the time, and I imagine it must be quite frustrating as someone who works in this field, the way in which things are sometimes simplified in the news. So if there was one core principle of understanding these reports that you wish everybody could understand better, what would that be?
Think about the data, I suppose. That is the underlying basis for the claims that are being made. It is difficult because ordinary people are not so familiar with survey research that they understand the different kinds of sampling or the consequences of doing random samples versus quota samples or using opt-in surveys and so on. There's a tendency to just say, oh, well, it was a survey and therefore the numbers must be right, or I never believe numbers, so they must be wrong. There are real qualitative differences between good studies and bad studies, and I appreciate that it's very difficult for ordinary people to make those distinctions. But I think maybe just a recognition that we should neither be cynical and dismiss everything as being the product of self-interest or group interest, nor accept everything as scientific and therefore true, that for better or worse, some evaluation of evidence is called for, and there are good surveys and bad surveys, and good articles or reports or books and less good ones. And we need to try to be open to new information while wary of misinformation.
A very good moral for us all. Before we go, we have our standard closing question. We ask all our guests, what's something which you've changed your mind on recently, and what inspired that change?
This will be a little bit of a downer. I'll try to express it in a positive way. I have, through most of my career, been very positive about journalism and journalists. And I've often told academics, students, that they should think and write more like journalists. That is, they should look for the story, tell us why something is important, write about it clearly, not using jargon, seek to explain the significance of the findings, and not just take it for granted that because something is the output of a survey, it must be worth talking about. So I have generally been a great advocate of journalists and the process of journalism as a way of promoting the public understanding of science or religion or anything else. Unfortunately, the experience of the quiet revival, so-called, somewhat shook my faith into this view. And there was an awful lot of lazy journalism where the typical modus operandi would be for journalists to get hold of this man bites dog story. Oh, church-going has suddenly gone up, and it's young men who are leading the way, taking it for granted that it must be true because there's a piece of paper that describes it and a poll that evidently shows it. And then going out and finding a few anecdotes that aren't difficult to find of young men coming to faith or churches that are growing. And lo and behold, there's your story. So you have the one key general finding illustrated by a few anecdotes, and that would be how it worked. And you would just get the same sort of story written over and over again. And I think that's disappointing. I don't think that the very best journalists did that, but there were an awful lot of lazy journalists who did do that. And that's a danger and a warning that there will be anecdotal evidence for almost anything. Mm-hmm. And so, again, it's incumbent upon opinion formers, and I think journalists and commentators fall into that category, to be critical on behalf of ordinary people and really interrogate the value of things that are being claimed.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Dr. David Voas, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you. All the best.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Humanism Now. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And why not share this episode with a friend? It really helps more people hear about the show. And we're building a growing community over on Ko-Fi. Special thanks to our supporters. If you would like to join them, links are in the show notes. You can follow us on all social media at Humanism Now Pod. And thanks once again for listening to Humanism Now.